Again and again, Fat-Ass 45 has violated, evaded, and ignored the law. The Constitution says that the fat ass cannot accept payments from foreign governments, but Fat-Ass 45 did. The Constitution says that the principal officers of executive departments and members of the cabinet must be confirmed by the Senate. Fat-Ass 45 junked that rule by relying instead on his power to appoint temporary acting officials. A century and a half of legal precedents establish that the fat ass must generally comply with subpoenas from Congress, even if he does not like the questions. Again, Fat Ass 45 disregarded the seemingly established law. The courts have sometimes checked the Fat Ass 45 squadancy, but not always. But court decisions take years to decide and longer to enforce. In July, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress and New York State prosecutors could legally subpoena Fat-Ass 45's accounts and bankers for his financial records, a ruling that was followed by yet more Fat-Ass 45 litigation seeking to challenge or at least delay the subpoenas. Even the impeachment did not restrain Fat-Ass 45's strong grip on his party and on a sufficient minority of the American public protected him from the Constitution's ultimate remedy. The Fat-Ass 45 squadancy has exposed the degree to which presidential compliance with law is voluntary. The American system relies heavily on the squatter's own sense of honor and integrity, on the squatter's own wish to do what is right. The Fat-Ass 45 squadancy demonstrated how inadequate our custom and tradition to restrain a failed squatter determined to do wrong. Half a century ago, Congress and many states enacted ambitious reforms in response to Watergate and other abuses of the government power. The dominant theme of the 1970s reform was disclosure. Politicians would disclose more of their personal finances, parties, and campaigns, and it would disclose more of their donations. Executive branch agencies would disclose more to Congress, and Congress would open up more of its committee meetings to public view, and the sessions of the House and Senate to televised cameras. Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants, Louis Brandeis wrote in 1913, and the reformers in the 1970s adopted that motto as their own. Over the half-past century, some of those disclosure mechanisms have deteriorated. The fog of dark money has considerably obscured election finance, for example. But sunlight disinfects only when the general public and elite stakeholders care about what is disclosed. In the Fat-Ass 45 years, that assumption of the reformist creed of the 1970s has repeatedly proved false. Scandal after scandal has come to light without Fat-Ass 45 suffering political consequences severe enough to deter or correct his corrupt behavior. Fat-Ass 45 has done his best to defeat disclosure, notably by refusing to release his tax returns. Still, the main elements of Fat-Ass 45's behavior in office have become visible. There is no exact count of the public money that has flowed into Fat-Ass 45's businesses, but at a minimum it exceeds $1.1 million. There is no count at all of the money Fat-Ass 45 has collected from foreign governments, but it has been disclosed that representatives of 22 foreign nations have stayed at his properties, and it became a public scandal that he tried to score a massive international payday for himself by holding the 2020 G7 summit at his golf resort that he owns in Florida. There has been some disclosure of the flow of the Republican Party funds to Fat-Ass 45's businesses, at least $17 million since 2016. It's murkier how much Fat-Ass 45 pocketed from his 2017 inauguration committee, but court documents suggested this figure might be substantiated. Likewise, the defiance of congressional subpoenas happened in plain sight, and Fat-Ass 45 brought that fight to the Supreme Court and lost, but brought himself enough time to postpone any response until after the 2020 election. Many of the worst outrages of the Fat-Ass 45 years were blurted by the Fat-Ass himself on live television. Yes, he fired FBI Director James Comey in order to thwart an investigation of Fat-Ass 45's Russian connections. Yes, he asked China and Ukraine to deliver dirt on his most likely presidential election opponent. Yes, he wants to cram through a last-minute Supreme Court appointee to help him in the legal battles he expects after the 2020 vote. Americans saw and heard this, and many cared, but not all, and not enough. Think about the post-Watergate America, and it says it was a country characterized by strong center and weak partisanship. During the Watergate scandal, a president elected by almost 60% of the vote lost office when proof of his personal involvement in criminal activity turned the leaders of his own party against him. This is a vanished world. The Americans of the 20th century is more polarized and partisan than any time since the aftermath of the Civil War. Fat Ass 45 was elected by 46% of the vote, and nothing good or bad has much moved the dial ever since. In 2017, 2018, and the first half of 2019, Fat Ass 45 proceeded over the best economy since the late 1990s. His average approval rating has never topped 50%, and even in 2020, Fat Ass 45 presided over the worst sequence of disaster since the early 1930s. His poll numbers have never dipped below 40%. Actually, they have. When he was caught dead to the right in the Ukraine scandal, his party had stayed loyal to him, and with the exception of only a single senator. When he brazenly violated the law and delivered his nomination acceptance speech from the South Lawn of the White House, his party leadership joined him there. When he was recorded admitting that he had knowingly downplayed the pandemic in the century, there was hardly a murmur of reproach from his side. Disclosure assumes a political system that cares about the things disclosed, and that is not the political system in the United States. And that is not the political system the United States has in 2020. That insight particularly is the basis for a new sequence of political reforms that are being proposed by the House Democrats. September 23rd, the Protecting Our Democracy Act of 2020. That bill proposes more than a dozen measures to address specific abuses of the Fat Ass 45 years, and for the most part, disclosure alone is not considered a sufficient remedy. The first measure would be to restrict the presidential pardon power. It would prohibit self-pardon by any president, clarify that it is indeed illegal for a president to sell pardons, and require release to Congress of information about any pardon from the president or his family might personally benefit from it. The second measure would stop the clock on statutes of limitations for any federal crime committed by any president or vice president, because current rules forbid prosecuting the president for federal crimes. It's unfair that he can use this period in office to outrun federal crimes he might have committed before or during that tenure. The third measure would codify the emoluments clause of the U.S. Constitution into statute. Trump, Fat Ass 45 brazenly violated the clause, but the clause is not self-executing. The Constitution insists that the Fat Ass could not accept payments from foreign governments. It offers no guidance as to what should happen if the Fat Ass goes ahead and does it anyway. The third measure also restricts the Fat Ass's ability to pocket money from domestic interests, such as a party committee or party candidates. The fourth puts teeth into congressional subpoena powers. As things stand, it's up to the executive branch to enforce subpoenas, which has proved quite a problem when it is the executive branch that decides to ignore them. The new proposal would allow Congress to bypass the executive and ask courts to impose the fines on defiant office holders. The fifth would reduce the Fat Ass's scope to direct money that Congress voted to spend on one purpose and to instead spend it on a different purpose. The sixth would curtail the vast agglomeration of emergency powers horrifyingly detailed in The Atlantic back in 2019. The seventh one, and this does not rest on disclosure, but it would require the Attorney General to keep a log of his or her contacts at the White House and provide that log to the Department of Justice's Inspector General twice a year. The eighth would clarify that the Inspectors General may be removed only for cause. It would require the Fat Ass to provide documentation of that cause to Congress before the removal went into effect. The ninth one would protect the whistleblowers and clarify that it is indeed legal for whistleblowers to provide information directly to the relevant committee of Congress. The 10th would limit the maximum tenure of acting cabinet officials to only 3 months, or actually 4 months. 120 days would be about 4 months. The 11th would eliminate the courtesy that leaves enforcement of the Hatch Act to the Fat Ass when White House personnel are involved. Fat Ass 45 abused this courtesy to free his staff to do political work at taxpayer expense. This measure also raises the minimum fine under the Hatch Act to $50,000 and expedites collection of those fines. The 12th and 13th and 13th measures imposed new requirements on campaigns, candidates, and their families to report foreign contacts, and clarifies that, yes, it is illegal for a U.S. campaign to accept dirt on political adversaries from foreign persons and government. You probably imagine that many of these proposals were in law already. Arguably, many of them were, but a lot of existing anti-corruption law was informative and indicative rather than punitive. In a lecture that was delivered in 1897, the future Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. said that to truly understand the law, you must look at it as a bad man who cares only for the material consequences, which such knowledge enables them to predict, not as a good one, but who finds his reasons for conduct, whether inside the law or outside of it, in the vaguer sanctions of conscience. Until now, however, the law around the presidency did not work that way. Those should not take foreign emoluments. And it may impress the honest and patriotic president. But what if the fat ass is not honest or patriotic? Yeah, we know that fat ass 45 isn't. What happens if that fat ass accepts a foreign emolument? The answer turned out to be nothing much. As a result, a dishonest and unpatriotic fat ass grabbed with both hands and corrupted one of the two greatest political parties to a quease. The House Democrats' reform bill obviously will not be enacted as long as Fat Ass 45 can wield a veto. But if Fat Ass 45 is ejected in this year's election and the Senate Republicans who protected him lose their majority, the reform bill, or much of it, may become law. We've gone into some detail about the House Democrats' bill to underscore how moderate it is and how respectful it is of the important prerogatives of a legitimate presidency. The bill does not, to cite just one example, forbid the fat ass to talk to the Attorney General. But about a particular case, so almost in every case, the fat ass should refrain from doing that. It does not require the Attorney General to inform Congress about such conversations that would compromise the cohesion of the executive branch. It requires only that a record be kept and that it be shared at intervals with the Department of Justice's own pre-existing watchdog, the Inspector General, and that it would be available for later inspection by Congress if needed. The bill does not, to cite another example, empower Congress to enforce its subpoenas by inherent authority, as 19th century Congress sometimes does, that could easily lead to abuses of individual rights. Congressional subpoenas will be enforced in court, and the penalties for defiant subpoenas imposed by the court. The bill does not, to take a third example, blur the status of inspectors general as executive branch employees. It changes their status to make them more like civil servants, less like political appointees, but still chosen by and answerable to the executive, not Congress. Much of that bill deals with things that most of us had supposed were already rules. That the fat ass should not sell pardons, for example, or use them as part of cover-up scheme, but it turned out that rules against corrupt pardoning had been voluntarily adopted by past presidents. If a fat ass did not want to comply, the rule did not readily be enforced against him. In a way, you could read the bill as the yes. Fat Ass 45 was a criminal act of 2021, and that suggests two of the bills may be inevitable, but still poignant unintended consequences. First, most of the Protecting Our Democracy Act is mind-crushingly morally obvious. Don't accept clandestine political information from foreign governments, and don't use the White House for your convention speech. The act of writing such basic laws into effect in 2021 would lend some credibility to the future arguments of Fat Ass 45's enablers. Just much of what Fat Ass 45 did was distasteful, but it was not strictly illegal. Technically, it was. But that's why the country had to write new laws in 2021. I was appalled as anybody else. But there was nothing to do. The fat ass was acting within his rights as those existed in the time. That argument is mostly false. Fat Ass 45 did violate existing law. It was not, in fact, legal for him to use his official powers to extort foreign governments to fabricate political dirt on his political opponents. That was already prohibited by many laws. The problem was that the enforcement of those laws depended on mechanisms that had rusted out. It will be important to underscore that point in the future. And what went wrong in the Fat Ass 45 era was not that the fat ass delicately tiptoed around the law, What went wrong in the Fat Ass 45 era was that the cops in charge of the law were asleep, senile, or in cahoots with the fat ass. Second, the Protecting Our Democracy Act amounts to a confession that the impeachment power is a dead letter. The House imposed the severest sanction a Congress can impose against an errant fat ass at trial. However, the fat ass's co-partisans protected him from removal, and after the trial, the fat ass resumed his law-breaking. There have now been four serious presidential impeachment. There have now been four serious presidential pardons or impeachment. Impeachment process in history. Only four presidents have been impeached. Actually, three presidents have been impeached, and then a fat ass squatter. The presidents that have been impeached were Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton, and then the squatter was Fat Ass 45. In retrospect, it's clear that the important variable in the outcome was the state of party politics at the time of the impeachment. The Nixon Fat Ass 45 contrast is starkest. If Congress worked in the 2020s as it had in the 1970s, important Republicans would have broken ranks with Fat Ass 45 and forced his resignation. If Congress worked in the 1970s as it does in the 2020s, Nixon would have served out his term. We have fully arrived at the predicament that Lawrence Tribe and Joshua Matz warned of their book on the impeachment process. When impeachment is most needed, is less likely to be effective. When it's most likely to be effective, it is at least indeed needed. And so the House Democrats are making do with the fallback remedy, a second best or third best. These reforms are all welcome and necessary. It is a sad reflection on the state of U.S. politics that they are needed at all. The founders imagined that Congress could set aside political partalities to act as a court of law upon an unfit fat ass. That hope has proved one of their less workable ideas. Americans need to accept some sad realities about the state of their law and politics. That means new legislation that works around the defects of the impeachment remedy, takes into account the grim fact of the 21st century hyperpartisanship. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Random Mike, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when the new video comes out, and thanks for listening.